Yeah, I won't take up time. I mean, Laura, thank you for agreeing to present your work with us. I'm really looking forward to it. Dr. Laura Phillips has finished her PhD from NYU, New York University, where she examined processes of class formation in rural South Africa from apartheid to post-apartheid period. She continues to work on questions of class formation in rural South Africa, but is now also writing about the political economy of platinum mining and economic history of late apartheid South Africa. Over to you, Laura. So, as you know, we'll have a 35 minutes. I mean, please feel free to take as much time. We keep usually 25 minutes for discussion. So I'll just let you know when it's half an hour, and yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Hi, everybody. I do have some slides, but I'll just show them only when they kind of become relevant to the presentation. But thanks very much, everyone, for coming today. Yeah, so I'll speak for a bit and then look forward to questions and discussion afterwards. So what I'm presenting today is a paper that is really an effort at explaining how minerals became a form of property, a particular type of mineral. Platinum became a form of property in South Africa. And so quite a lot has already been written, mostly about the kind of privatization and commodification of land in Africa more generally, and of course quite a lot in South Africa. But the same kind of attention hasn't always, actually very rarely, has been paid to processes which turned minerals, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, into a particular form of property that was shaped by the processes that were going on around it. And in the South African case, there are kind of a couple different explanations for why this kind of gap exists in the literature. One might think that it has something to do with a lot of scholarship which focuses on, if it is focusing on minerals, on kind of the minerals that drove South Africa's major process of industrialization, diamond and gold, in the second half of the 19th century. And those minerals were found on land that was already, for the most part, classified as white owned land, and so it was quite quickly delineated as minerals on that land was quite quickly delineated as a private right that could be obtained by securing private rights to the land itself on a kind of open land market. So the story then of diamonds and gold, to the degree that they are wrapped up or told as being part of wrapped up in debates about property, really kind of focus on an earlier process of conquest, dispossession of land. But as we know from the work of various scholars from the kind of second half of the 20th century, particularly the 60s and 70s onwards in South Africa, the minerals energy complex, this is this kind of concept or this phrase that's been developed by Fine and Rustamji to characterize South Africa's political economy. The minerals energy complex expanded beyond, at this stage, beyond gold, and particularly focused on or included and incorporated another key mineral, another key resource, and that is platinum. And what I want to kind of suggest, the building a little bit on the work that does exist, which is particularly that of Gavin Capps and a few other scholars, Sonwabile Mngwana and a few others, that there isn't a huge amount written about kind of the political economy of platinum. And we don't really have a sense of how it is that platinum became property as opposed to just something under the ground. And the reason that this poses a new set of questions is because platinum, though originally discovered in the 1920s on a kind of a big seam that is called the Bushveld Igneous Complex, only booms in a sustained kind of way as a commodity on the world market from the 1960s onwards, at which point the land under which kind of the richest seams of platinum are found have already been classified as what were then called at the time native reserves in the 1960s, and were en route to becoming what were later the Bantustans or the homelands. and particularly two Bantustans and homelands where the richest seam of platinum was found was Bophuthatswana in what is today the Northwest Province, and Limpopo, or Leboa, what is it today, Limpopo. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen just to give you a sense of, I hope you can see that, give you a sense of where the rich platinum deposits can be found in South Africa. The western limb is in Bophuthatswana, or was in Bophuthatswana. The northern and the eastern limbs are in Limpopo, were in Leboa. And you can see kind of where that fits into the broader map of South Africa. It's on the top right-hand side of my screen. I don't know if it's flipped on your side, but yeah, you can get a sense of it from that. Okay, so there are different ways to tell the story of how minerals, platinum in particular, became property in a certain time and in a certain place. And the one way to tell that story is through the law, tracking development of laws in the region in which minerals get defined in South Africa, particularly in South Africa's case through the adoption of Roman Dutch law and a series of related legal codes. And in this process, minerals get defined as something separate. They get severed from the land, from the surface rights, and they can be owned in different ways through title deeds by the state. And this is a process that we could track through the law. But I want to suggest that this explanation about how platinum became property, though correct, is only partial. It doesn't really explain the really very complex contestations that happened over minerals, multiple claims being made to minerals as a property form, overlapping claims often, and how this played out with very dramatic effect in the late years of apartheid. So instead, I want to offer a different way about thinking about minerals and how they were turned into property. And this way really sits at the intersection of, first, law, debates about law. Second, debates and processes of land dispossession. And third, the making of political authority in what I say were first called the native reserves and later on the Bantustans. And political authority, or that's kind of a code for the making and the bolstering of the power of the chieftaincy. And that's the political authority that I'm referring to. So those who know the literature about land in South Africa, these three kind of elements may sound very much like a story about the creation of landed property regimes in South Africa, and in fact, beyond South Africa as well. How is tribal tenure created? Where is communal property developed as a form of ownership as opposed to title tenure? But I think that there is another element that makes this story about minerals one that is, on the one hand, linked, but nonetheless.
What is this, Annie?
Oh, sorry, someone asking a question?
No.
Okay, I'll carry on. So the story about minerals, while in many ways it has these key features to the debates and the scholarship around land and the making of land as a form of property, there's another element that I think that makes minerals and the process in which minerals are turned into property linked, but quite distinctive nonetheless to that of land. And that is the fact, this is kind of the fourth element that I'm adding to the story, the fact that from 19th century and perhaps even earlier, from the 19th century, there is a prohibition on Africans prospecting and mining minerals. And so what this means, I'm suggesting, is that to come into existence as a form of property with the practical implications that I was teasing out a little bit earlier, platinum and minerals are made in the interaction and the relationship between mining capital and local African power brokers and residents on the land. Okay, so I'm now going to try and get into kind of the nitty-gritty of the story, but as I go through it, I hope that you'll keep this kind of argument, this framing I've offered at the back of your mind to shape some of the more empirical details that I'm going to talk through. But sorry, just before I do that, what I want to just quickly flag is that though I'm talking about platinum in general, I'm using a particular case study of a series of developments around land and mining in a place called Ga-Mphahlele. So I'm just going to change the slide now. This is a very kind of honed in a map of the area around Ga-Mphahlele, and you can see it is situated in the Leboa Bantustan, or rather was situated in the Leboa Bantustan. And if you see on the map, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but if you just look at slightly north or slightly above Leboa, where it says Leboa, to where it says Leboa Homo, that is where Ga-Mphahlele is. Ga-Mphahlele is used to refer to the place. Mphahlele is used to refer to kind of the political polity that is based in Ga-Mphahlele. And just to give you a slightly more zoomed out look of where Ga-Mphahlele is in relation to the other Bantustans, other homelands, and South Africa more broadly, here you can see another map. Leboa, the Bantustan that Ga-Mphahlele is in, is towards the north of the country in that light green color. And Ga-Mphahlele is kind of in the heart of that. Okay, so I'm now going to move into the details of the story, tracking this process that I've kind of tried to sketch out a little bit. So in the late 19th century, a young, very charismatic royal, by all accounts, a man called Mphahlele, broke from the rule of his father, who was based in what is today Tsenin, fled the territory and landed in what became known as Ga-Mphahlele. When he arrived in the area, Mphahlele found local populations who were already living, who'd settled there. Many were kind of loosely affiliated to the structures of Sekhukhune land, which was a region close by. But over a period of several decades, Mphahlele and then his successors after he died subjugated these local groupings, but through a process of kind of, on the one hand, sometimes violence, but other time political negotiation. And by the 1880s, Mphahlele's descendants then managed to claim rule over this very vast territory that was referred to as Ga-Mphahlele, though not everybody who lived there recognized the Mphahlele's or the leader of Mphahlele's as their leader. When the Tsar, the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, established the Location Commission. I'm not going to go into much detail about what this was, but when they established the Location Commission in the 1880s, what effectively they were trying to do, or ostensibly claim what they were trying to do, was demarcate land, protect land for what were termed as the native tribes. Mphahlele had quite a good relationship with the local white authorities and was recognized as the leader of a clear tribe in the language of the time, and therefore deserving as land in this location. And as part of this Location Commission, they investigated kind of what counted as Mphahlele land, and eventually decided that they would cordon off 17 farms for the Mphahlele location. And so in the process, what this ended up doing, though, as I say, the claim was this protected the land for African access. What it also ended up doing was intervening in existing patterns of settlement, putting pressure on those who aligned to Mphahlele then to move into the set of farms that are being cordoned off as part of this location, within these location boundaries. And so we can say that the formalization of the Ga-Mphahlele location reconfigured land usage. It kind of was part of an early process of dispossession. And despite historically living on a far wider range of farms across the region, it confined people who affiliated to Mphahlele to this allocated set of farms. At the same time, what it did is took these farms off the open market, prevented anyone purchasing them, and rather put it in the hands of who were then the Minister of Native Affairs, who held onto these as a trustee on behalf of the Mphahlele. But there was this very strong feeling amongst Mphahlele leaders and many of Mphahlele's followers that their allocated land, in this process of delineating the land in the Location Commission, the allocated land was inadequate. Especially compared to the earlier size of the territory that many had occupied. And so there was a thinking, what should we do? And the decision, and this is noteworthy because it's a decision that surrounding political communities do not take, though many do in West in what becomes Bophuthatswana. The decision is that what the Mphahlele are going to do is buy back the land. In particular, this contrasts it, or a very well-known case, to the Pedi Paramountcy in Sekukuni land, who had been quite recently in the same period devastated in a war with the British, but were unwilling to purchase land that they considered rightfully theirs. There's a different set of kind of dynamics driving the Mphahlele's decision to buy land. And so in the early 1890s, the chief at the time, a descendant of the original Mphahlele, Matime Mphahlele, decided that that the political structure should buy back some of their farms. But they needed money to do this. And so the way in which the money was raised was that the chief imposed a levy on the residents in the region. Those who didn't have cash were expected to donate their cattle. Many, however, were very reluctant to do so. And not only was this decision to buy back the land highly contested, Mphahlele himself, the recognized chief, in the eyes of the state at least, did not have unequivocal support from those living in the region. So despite collecting money to purchase the idea was they were going to purchase 11 farms. For a range of complicated reasons, I'm not going to go into them now, only 2 farms in the end were transferred into the name of this Mphahlele tribe. And this is the political designation given to the grouping at the time, the Mphahlele tribe. The outstanding 9 were stuck in this complex legal limbo for some years, but when the new government of the Transvaal established another location commission in the early 20th century, 1905, it was recommended that these 9 farms that the Mphahlele had gathered money to buy, that they should be included in the boundaries of the location, but on one key condition, that the Mphahlele waive their claim to these farms as private property. And this is key, and it really speaks to some of the debates that were going on at the time about whether private property and title tenure were appropriate forms of property for Africans. So I'm just going to quickly share this very complex map. It'll make sense in a few minutes, but if you look here, you'll see Mphahlele location. Those were that was the land that was set aside in the first location commission designated for the Mphahlele's. It's kind of in the center. I hope you can see it. So there was a third process then that I also just want to make mention of land and property relations that got underway in these first decades of the 20th century. Discuss the state-owned land through the creation of these locations, a few instances in where the tribal authority buys land for 2 farms in particular, but there's a third way as well. It's a very unusual way, but it was the case that in some instances where there were loopholes in the law, that individual Black South African residents could purchase land even after the Land Act, after 1913. Land buyers, there were a few land buyers in Ga-Mphahlele. They were often quite politically prominent individuals. They'd accumulated wealth through a range of different strategies. And I'm not going to go into much detail about which farms were purchased. A couple were, but let me just emphasize here that for our purposes, for the purpose of the argument that I want to make, 2 farms adjacent to the boundaries of the location were purchased. And I'm going to again share screen, flip to the next slide. Sorry, I outlined them in red, but I've got a bit of a shaky hand, so they're a bit squiggly, the lines, but you can see the 2 at the bottom. If you look closely, one's Dwarsrand, the other's Davidpoort. And I also outlined slightly to the west of the Mphahlele location, Ga-Mphahlele, which is the farm that was purchased, one of the 2 farms that was purchased in the immediate aftermath of that first location commission. However, despite the fact that those 2 farms at the bottom, Davidspoort and Dwarsrand, were privately purchased, they were over a period of time kind of de facto included in the Mphahlele territory. After the original owners died, their descendants left the region, and in the coming decades, ownership of the farms became really quite murky. And when the Ga-Mphahlele territory was formally delineated a bit later down the line by subsequent governments, the official documents listed these farms, amongst others, as tribally owned farms, almost in the same category as the one Ga-Mphahlele, which had been purchased before. So despite all these complications, in the first few decades of the 20th century, what we have in the region are three types of land tenure or property, created first by what I outlined, this process of dispossession, while at the same time also created by the recognition by the state of the Mphahlele chieftaincy. And what I'm going to go on to suggest now is that this process was intertwined with the developments of minerals as a form of property. Okay, so while this land was purchased, it was fought over, there was various struggles over it. Another form of property, minerals were also in the process, early days of being kind of defined and delineated. In fact, as early as the 1880s, geologists had identified some minerals of interest in the region, in Ga-Mphahlele, and then after the identification of these minerals, there was a debate and a discussion about what the nature of the property rights of these minerals might be. The debate was shaped by a range of different things that were going on, a law, a 1908 law, which allowed the severing, I referred to this earlier, of mineral from land rights. And was also shaped, the debate about what these mineral rights could or should look like, was also shaped by a process in which Africans, minerals, and also land were taken out of the hands of African residents, a series of kind of segregationist and racist laws, and handed over to the Minister of Native Affairs, who acted then as a trustee on behalf of the Africans. This, however, is all quite ad hoc at the time, but it became more urgent, exactly what the nature of these mineral rights might be in 1924. Why? Because in 1924, there was this massive discovery of platinum in on that region that I showed you earlier in an earlier slide, a section of which, of this very rich platinum reef ran through Ga-Mphahlele. And prospectors, company representatives swarmed across the region, trying to lay claim to the minerals as a form of property. But what this meant in practical terms was a sudden effort to define, try and alienate and shape the nature of these mineral rights. There are many examples which I could give, and I won't go into any detail, but just to note here that in this process of shaping and trying to define the mineral rights, there was huge contestation. It wasn't clear exactly what constituted a mineral right. And in one instance, on a farm that the Ga-Mphahlele was designated as a Ga-Mphahlele Tribal Authority farm, Ga-Mphahlele, the one outlined in red on the map, which had been purchased in an earlier period. It was understood that when the purchase happened, the minerals hadn't yet been severed from the land. And so in some people's minds, this meant that the minerals were owned by the Ga-Mphahlele Authority. But what that meant was also very confusing. And when the chief at the time tried to sell these minerals on, there was huge contestation that reflected much of the friction and tension within the chieftaincy, and a real push by one man in particular, in this instance that I'm thinking of, Ben Leshilo, who had long clashed with the chief, who was politically prominent in his own right, who argued that the land and the minerals had been purchased by a collective of people, and therefore they could not be treated as a private right that could be sold on just with a signature or the consent of the chief. This is just one of many examples which show the kind of contestation about who owns mineral property and how one can own minerals as a form of property. But this process of contesting and trying to figure out what it meant that minerals could be owned separately from land really came to an abrupt halt by the early 1930s. Though there was huge excitement in the mid-1920s when the platinum reef was discovered, and for a brief period of time there was a boom, a commodity boom, and everyone wanted platinum on the world market. This slowly became less desirable, and then after the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, which kind of found its way into South African politics and South African economic pushes and pulls, ultimately the platinum market collapsed, and the debates and the desperate and urgent efforts to get control over minerals, particularly platinum, all fell away. This is the 1930s. Okay, so we end that part of the section with at the period of the 1930s. And as I say, it was only really in the 1960s that platinum as a commodity started to boom again. But a lot of key things happen in this 35-year period. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but what I want to emphasize are one or two developments that mean that when platinum and minerals are engaged again as a form of property in the 1960s, the terms on which they are debated have shifted. The nature of the political environment has shifted somewhat. And in particular, what I want to just flag briefly is the most significant development for the purpose of this argument in this period, which is the introduction of Bantu authorities in 1951. You know, apartheid comes in 48. The Bantustans get declared over a period of time, but really by the early 1970s, the Bantustans, and particularly Leboa, the Bantustan where Ga-Mphahlele is based, becomes declared as a self-governing territory in 1972. But the key kind of historical development, I think, is the creation of these Bantu authorities in 51. I'm hoping most people know what that is, so I won't go into any details. But what I would like to emphasize in relation to the creation of Bantu authorities in 51 is that at first, the Ga-Mphahlele chieftaincy resists adopting Bantu authorities. There's this real pushback against efforts to have the chieftaincy incorporated and bureaucratized into the structure of the state. But the chief at the time, who takes this very strong stance, eventually gets replaced in 1975. At this point, Leboa has already been created as a Bantustan, and this chief is replaced with a regent, a chieftainess, who holds the position, who had a very close relationship with the chief minister of Leboa, Cedric Patudi. But the point here to emphasize is that by the time that the platinum market looks very profitable again, more and more mining companies are interested in prospecting and mining in Ga-Mphahlele, the political authority, often vested with the power over land and related resources, i.e. minerals, has the backing of the South African state and the Leboa government, because unlike her predecessor, she was willing to accept Bantu authorities and everything that went with it. Okay. I'm now going to move us into the last kind of key part of the paper, which is really the crux of the paper. And if you think back to the early argument I make, this is where it really all comes together. And the way I'm going to do this is by looking at three, depending on how the timing goes, maybe just two case studies that really show that when platinum became a desirable commodity again in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to get it out of the ground, to engage with it as a form of property, it was transformed into through a particular set of political and social relationships into a form of property that could be exchanged and could be used as a commodity. Okay, so the first example that will kind of show how this all came together comes out of the interests of a large mining company called the Messina Transvaal Development Company, shorthand Messina Company, which applied for prospecting rights on a number of farms in the Ga-Mphahlele area, including that farm Ga-Mphahlele at the bottom, just to the west of the Mphahlele location. And so this, just as a reminder, this is one of the farms that Ga-Mphahlele had purchased, received the title deed to in the late 19th century. And now it was understood in this period now by the South African state, also by the Leboa government, that the minerals on Ga-Mphahlele, despite the earlier discussion and debates in the 1920s about them, the minerals hadn't yet been severed from the farm, or from the land rather. And so the land and everything that goes with it was owned by Ga-Mphahlele, by the tribal authority. So permission needed to be sought then from Mphahlele tribal authority, which is really to say the representatives of Mphahlele, of the tribal authority, the chieftainess, to get prospecting rights to these minerals. But they themselves, because of the law that I mentioned earlier, because they were Black, could not sign, but rather gave permission to the Minister of Development, no longer the Minister of Native Affairs, the Minister of Development, to give consent to Messina to access these minerals on Mphahlele's behalf. And then at the point at which this company, the Messina company, wanted to convert these prospecting rights into mining rights, another deal had to be made. And the Mphahlele Mining Committee is kind of an outsourced committee developed by the tribal authority, took charge of negotiations with the blessing of the trustee over the minerals. It was mandated by the tribal authority and chaired by someone called R.R. Ratau R.R. Mphahlele. His family had a long history working with the tribal authority. He himself was an advisor to the chieftainess, had long held important influence over the Leboa government, and were well positioned to negotiate and navigate the dynamics of the region and the broader interests of the Leboa government. So in the minds of the Messina and minds of the company, to work with R.R. Mphahlele and his mining committee was for them really to work with the people who had the power to secure the mining deal for them. So as early as 1987, though the prospecting lease had been given in an earlier period by 1987, Messina had received assurances from R.R., from his committee, that the residents who are living on this farm, Ga-Mphahlele, would accept that they may have to be relocated should mining begin on the farm, and that they would get no compensation whatsoever. R.R., as the representative, gives his assurances to Messina that this is what the case will be. So instead, while Messina would pay no compensation for potential removals, they would pay a monthly rental for use of the surface rights to the Mphahlele tribal authority, not to individual residents who lived on the land. And instead, what would happen is that funds would flow then to the tribal authority, and in exchange for offering this tribal resolution and the subsequent mineral lease, 50,000 shares were offered to the Leboa government, not even to the tribal authority. Then 62,000 shares to the tribal authority of Messina, 62,000 shares of this Messina mine, and a further 100,000 were preferentially priced and earmarked for residents to purchase themselves. So what we see here is platinum as property, but owned collectively by the Mphahlele, but this in effect is just a faction, a political faction in this very complex polity that owns and controls this what is emerging as a mineral right under Ga-Mphahlele, under the farm. And noteworthy too, I want to emphasize, is that the Leboa government in this deal and several others, this is just one representative deal, is understood as a key stakeholder in this newly defined piece of property that are minerals on the farm Ga-Mphahlele. So we're starting to get a sense here of how in the interaction between R.R. Mphahlele and everything he represents with the company Messina, there's a particular set of property relations that are imposed on the platinum under the ground. So now I want to point to another example where platinum took on property rights, again, shaped by the interaction between local political power and mining companies. And this set of deals starts a little bit later in 1989, so we're kind of final years, things are unraveling in apartheid South Africa. A new mining company comes on the scene called Trojan Exploration, and it applies for prospecting rights on those two farms at the bottom there, Davidspoort and Dwarsrand. These are the two which had been privately purchased by a number of Black residents in the early 20th century. Trojan came up against the superior power of kind of really major mining houses, but did surprisingly well in seeking out minerals in the region across Leboa. And one of their successes was tracking down the descendants of the original purchasers of these two farms at the bottom of the screen there. So while, as I'd said earlier, these farms were privately owned, they had effectively been incorporated into the jurisdiction of Mphahlele. partially because they've been subdivided, they've been inherited by many different descendants of the buyers, and there was really very little sense of continuity from the original purchase in the early 20th century to the contemporary period. It's a mixture of kind of Bantu authorities, which I referred to earlier, the creation of the Bantustans themselves, and this continued process of land possession also drove this de facto inclusion of these farms, which had been privately owned, into the jurisdiction of the chieftaincy. So once Trojan had identified these minerals, Trojan, the company, the Leboa government as well, and the Mphahlele tribal authority were engaged in this really complex back and forth, not only about accessing the minerals, but in the first instance, to define them as a form of property that could be owned, it could be leased out. And the issue for debate and for contestation was who owned the minerals in the first question. Could these owners control the minerals as a commodity? And if not, then who controlled them on their behalf? I see a message has come up in the chat. Is that my 30 minutes, last 5 minutes? Okay, yeah. I'll just finish off with this example. Thanks, Anandru. So in 1990 then, in an attempt to bypass some of these questions, the descendants of the original purchasers, with the blessing of the tribal authority, transferred the land, and this is really very interesting, and the resources attached to the land into two newly established companies named after these farms, Dwarsrand Incorporated and Davidspoort Limited. Sorry, they're both limited companies. But turning the minerals and land into corporatized entities actually didn't solve the problem as the owners of the companies were classified as black, and so they weren't empowered to take decisions over minerals, despite the fact that now the land and the related resources attached to it were owned by this corporate entity. You can imagine they were hugely frustrated, really infuriated by this, but nonetheless conceded that to move ahead with the mineral deal, this company Trojan would need to obtain approval for the transaction from a higher political authority. Who this should be, also under huge contestation, and after much back and forth, it was decided that the Leboa Minister of Economic Affairs would act as the trustee to facilitate the contract. So in this case, what we have is a really complex and highly negotiable understanding of property rights in flux as minerals are being shaped as this form of property. And in the end, the mineral rights are privately owned, though subject to the control, firstly, of the tribal authority, and that then is overseen by the Leboa administration. Okay, I'm going to end there, and let me just say one or two kind of concluding remarks. So in tracking this process, and it's kind of quite a complex story over the course of the late 19th and into the 20th century, what I've been trying to show is kind of a couple different threads, tie things all together such that by the 1970s and 1980s, there's a new process of defining minerals as a form of property. And the sets of kind of historical processes that are in play here are firstly dispossession and the making of these native reserves. This puts minerals into the hands of the state through, as I mentioned earlier, the location commissions, through Bantu authorities as well. Another key factor here is law, and particularly that the law creates ways to start thinking about minerals as something separate from surface, from the land rights. Also, chieftaincy, by giving the chief and later the chieftainess power to control land and related resources on behalf of the community, the way in which the minerals shape up in this area as a form of property are seriously shaped by this development of the chieftaincy. And then this last point, which is I think really quite, I hope not too provocative, but kind of quite a new point, is that the making of these minerals as a form of property also gets made in the relationship between the supposed representative of the region, the local power, local political authority, and the mining company or representatives who hold mining companies' interests. And so I'm going to leave it there. And thanks everyone for listening. Let me stop share.
Thanks, Laura. It's fascinating. We have good 20 minutes for questions and comments. So the floor is open. Please go ahead. You can just switch on your video and ask the question, or you can use the raise hand option, whatever works. Carmelita, yes. Go ahead, Camel.
Hi, Laura. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Yes, okay. Thanks for the very interesting paper. And I just had one maybe simple question, but I wanted to know how you were thinking about this from the kind of maybe, late 60s, early 70s. The apartheid state is thinking about justifying Bantustans and, of course, what would become, especially the homelands, on an international global level, and saying, of course, that this is part of a decolonization process, blah, blah, blah. And part of the argument they were making of that was that some of these homelands like Bophuthatswana and what was called the Venda homeland had mineral resources, and that they were giving, these Bantustans a way of accumulating capital and having control over resources, and basically saying, this is not to cut you off from the economy of South Africa, but actually to allow you to control your own, economies, or whatever the case is. So, I just wanted to know how that kind of fits in this story,
Should I answer? Should I take that one?
I think, Andrew, there's another question. Please go ahead. Yes.
Hi, Laura. I'd like to follow up with that, because you mentioned the Leboa government at one moment, but in your conclusion, they disappeared again. And there's a whole hierarchy between the Leboa, between the various Bantustan governments, and then the apartheid government itself, and the national government, and the Bantu. You referred to a Minister of Development. I assume you meant the Bantu Administration and Development, Minister of BAD. And there's a whole hierarchy of control over both land, and therefore through the property and the minerals which are accessible via the land. So again, I think Carmelita's picked it up in the specifics of those of that particular period, but it seems to me that I was missing that whole going all the way up to Pretoria, or maybe down to Pretoria, but you know what I mean.
Thank you for the question. Laura, why don't you take these two and then we can come back for another round? Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so this presentation, I should just say, is a presentation. There's a paper backing it, which has some of the more kind of technical details which speak to some of these issues. But what is really interesting, and thanks for the question, it gives me an opportunity to speak to some of these issues, is that Leboa, there's kind of a distinction that first needs to be made. Leboa is called a self-governing territory. It is one of 6 self-governing territories, and then there are 4 which are nominally independent, one of which is Bophuthatswana. And so the control over resources differs quite a lot in those 2 different categories of Bantustans. Ultimately, the South African state is it has the most power, and it can insert itself, and for the most part manages to do that up until kind of right at the very end of apartheid, so that for that and many other reasons, independence is really a bit meaningless. But in terms of kind of the technical legal details about land ownership and that kind of thing, it does become significant. But the way in which I think this is particularly relevant to the Leboa story. So I'm going to just hive that off from the Bophuthatswana story in particular, because there are a whole set of other dynamics that are going on there. The way this is particularly relevant to the Leboa story is that until 1986, right until the very end of 1986, December 1986, minerals in Leboa are owned, about 60% of minerals in Leboa, though which minerals, how they are formed, all the kind of questions I was alluding to are still very hazy and murky, but in some kind of technical form, they're understood to be owned by the South African by a branch of the South African state, a kind of a subgrouping in the SADT within the Development Trust, which is a hangover, which is a long existing hangover from the Development Trust, which was created in 36. So these are kind of controlled by the South African state. But in 86, there is growing unhappiness, not only in Leboa and some of the other self-governing territories too, and the one that has the most leverage at this point and on this question is KwaZulu, to transfer minerals, even though what minerals mean is kind of quite nebulous, and particularly land, into the control of the Bantu, of the self-governing Bantustan. And the way to understand that, I mean, there hasn't been a huge amount of writing on this, but the way that I understand that, it's part of the reform movement that the South African state is trying to get Bantustan leaders on its side, and is trying to, particularly with Buthelezi, trying to get him to kind of play ball with them. So they hand over land and, in theory, minerals. In the case of Leboa, so now they've got much more of the land, which had previously been controlled and owned by the South African state, and in theory, the minerals. And those minerals are put into a kind of a legal vehicle called the Leboa Minerals Bureau, which later gets transformed to something called the Leboa Minerals Trust. But only up until about 91, what this Leboa Minerals Bureau is ostensibly, it's got total independence from the South African state. It can make decisions as it wants to about how minerals, what minerals get kind of put into a register, what minerals can then be alienated, how they can be parceled out. But it is this very confusing institution that gets very quickly co-opted by mining companies in general, and in particular what eventually becomes Anglo Platinum, which manages to stitch up like the richest platinum resources in Leboa. And so the way in which I think Leboa remains relevant to the story, but can also be kind of included in some of the categories that I've been speaking about thus far, or kind of the framework that I've used to try and discuss the issue thus far, is that when it holds, up until effectively just before democracy, when it holds mineral rights, again, nebulous, who knows what mineral rights are, but when it holds mineral rights, it effectively acts in concert with mining capital and Anglo Platinum in particular to apportion those mineral rights. And it means that the way that it is relevant is that it eases up, it creates access, it helps open up access very, very quickly. And one could imagine that would have been, Anglo is incredibly powerful. I'm sure they would have got the mineral rights at the end, but the process is made that much easier because they've got the Leboa Minerals Bureau at first and later the Minerals Trust on their side. So if I can just refer back to some of the kind of the broader comments that Kamalisa was making about how this fits into the discussion about the Bantustans as kind of these fictions of decolonized South Africa and under apartheid. For a long time, and if you read the Hansards, the parliamentary debates within Leboa, and I'm sure in many of the other Bantustans as well, there are many people who say we cannot be independent, and in Leboa's case, they refuse independence. And particular ministers in the Leboa government say, I can't even talk about independence if we can't have control over land and minerals. And the nature of that debate changes after 1986, except because now in theory, the power and the kind of control of these minerals and land has been handed over to Leboa, but by 1986, the game is up. And so it's too little too late. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Hi, Lauren. Hi.
Hi, sorry, was that someone?
Yeah,
I
okay.
missed that?
Hi, sorry. Yeah, thanks for the excellent presentation. I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about the last point. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to summarize the last point that you made about the making of minerals as private property and how it is shaped by several actors. Could you say a bit more on that? You mentioned on the one hand the mining companies, the tribal authority, and the apartheid government. I hope I got that right, but I just wanted you to say a bit more because I thought it was an important point you were making there. Thanks.
Is there other questions which Laura can take? Otherwise, Laura, why don't you just respond to Manda, and we can come back again.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So the argument that I'm trying to make is that partially because Black Africans are not allowed to engage in mining, legally then they can't deal with minerals and kind of sell them, but also to do mining you need huge capital, and for all the reasons we know, that's not available to most Africans in the course of the 20th century. The argument is that for those two reasons, the debates really and the contestation around accessing minerals, particularly in the areas which have already been classified as I say, first native reserves and later Bantustans, for that reason, these debates and contestations only really come to the fore when mining companies or the interests of mining companies are getting involved. And so in the 1920s, you have the first instance of this with this short-lived commodity boom for platinum, but there's a little bit of an effort to try and debate who can hold mineral rights, what you can do with those minerals, what constitutes a mineral right, is it a private right, is it a communal right? And if it's a communal right, who can act on behalf, who are the different constituents who make up the community, the communal structure? But as I say, with the collapse in the platinum price and generally a kind of a worldwide depression, those debates and those issues all kind of go quiet for a period of almost 30 to 35 years. But they pick up again when platinum becomes desirable again, in the 60s, 70s, 80s and onwards. And so it's in trying to get access to in quite a physical way, not just to hold, and you do get a few instances of this where mining companies are holding minerals speculatively. They're not doing anything with them. They just kind of sit on their books. But when they're trying to get hold of these minerals to either prospect, you actually physically have to go underground. Prospecting often isn't a huge kind of physical intervention, depending on exactly where you are and what the mineral is. But then if you're moving from prospecting to actually doing the mining yourself, you're bumping up immediately with a set of relations on the ground, around property, around political authority. And it is in that interaction with the mining companies trying to begin the process of accessing and holding onto those minerals, and coming up against these political, social processes on the ground, that the contestation happens that creates the mineral right, or rather creates minerals as a form of property that are debated, that are contested, and ultimately shaped into something that can be sold and commodified. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Questions, comments? We still have 6 minutes.
Maybe I could say, just as a side point, the debates. Sorry, can I add?
Yeah, sure.
Comments?
Yeah.
The literature about platinum mostly is focused on Bophuthatswana because they've been very dramatic legal battles and political battles in what was then Bophuthatswana and now in the Northwest, and that is for a range of complicated reasons, but one of which is because, like in the case of Ga-Mphahlele, the Bafokeng Tribal Authority, though they're kind of a relatively modern political construction, have over the course of the late 19th and 20th century been able to make claims to minerals and mineral property in the region. And so when in that case, in the case of Bafokeng, Impala Platinum, rather than Anglo, Impala being one of the other major platinum companies, when Impala Platinum tried to access the minerals on Bafokeng territory, they got involved in this very, very drawn out, often quite violent contestation over who controlled those minerals. And the Bafokeng said that we control the minerals. Though many people within the region would say not you, the Bafokeng chieftaincy, but smaller polities who now affiliate or kind of subsumed into the Bafokeng chieftaincy, as they say we control the minerals, whereas the chief minister, the former and now late chief minister of Bophuthatswana, Lucas Mangope, made the claim that the Bophuthatswana government, with him as the representative, would sign off on all deals made with those minerals, for those minerals. The Bafokeng managed to contest this in court over the course of the 1990s and won a huge payout. I see several people here on the call who will know much more about this than I do, and so perhaps could speak to that. But it was in this interaction with Impala and then the subsequent legal battles about who had the authority to sign away these rights that the nature of the platinum in the Bafokeng territory became conceptualized through contestation as a particular type of particular form of property.
Thanks, Laura. If we still have some time, if I will then, abuse my position as the moderator. I was just wondering. I really enjoyed the presentation. I would like to read the paper if at some point. I was wondering how the granularity feeds into, I think, what the couple of questions were asking you to kind of fit the granular discussions of property making into more slightly larger conversations of political state making. I think that I think some of the questions were there because I'm thinking of the Bafokeng, some of the ethnicity incorporated material in the Komarov book. Some of this dynamic is there, but that's from some of it from the other side of what the property of tribe is or belonging is, which is sort of a slightly parallel conversation to what property is in terms of the mineral. So I was wondering if there is something similar going on in terms of that other sense of property, where ethnicity is being ethnicity incorporated in that sense. Because I was also trying to think in terms of whatever, and I'm not an expert, but in terms of the historiography, the other STs in the Gabriela Hecht's work on uranium, for instance, has a very different, and I find that a little, when I'm listening to your work, your granularity actually goes against, almost that experientially, rendition of what Hecht does, what people feel about, extraction without going into how property mediates that experience. So I was just wondering if you could at all, does it speak to these kind of other conversations or historiography, and if it does, how?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'd have to think about this kind of a bit more carefully, but an initial response is there is lots of resonance with the work around kind of the Komarov's work on ethnicity and it becoming kind of this corporatized structure, and some of these battles that I'm referring to, and particularly I referred to, and I hope people managed to catch it, I sped through it quite quickly, is that a particular faction of the chieftaincy, of this Ga-Mphahlele chieftaincy, were driving a series of these mineral deals. They were signing off on them and there was pushback against them. And some of that pushback relates to long-standing political contestations in the region around the concretization of, in the first instance, a Sotho, Northern Sotho/Leboa ethnicity, which is super contested. It all gets lumped together to create the Leboa Bantustan. But then even more granular, what it means to affiliate to Ga-Mphahlele, or affiliate to the Mpahleles and live in what is now called Ga-Mphahlele. And so a lot of that factional fighting, or factional tensions rather, which are overridden because the chieftainess from 1975 onwards has the backing of the Leboa state first, and then the South African state second. So she's able just to like push, squash almost all resistance up until other dynamics come into play in the late 1980s. But what a lot of that political tension is around who is in and who is out, and who can make claims to legitimate authority in the region. And in fact, the example that I didn't go into much detail, but I think is a really fascinating example, is some of these early debates around minerals in the mid 1920s after the first platinum commodity boom. There is a lot of people who are saying that the chief at the time can't go about selling minerals. They can't alienate them on his own terms, and he can't sell them without consent of a wider group of people. And the person in particular who's making that argument is someone whose family his family lived in the area long before Ga-Mphahlele arrived, and refused, and was one of the group of people who did not want to contribute cattle or cash to the purchasing of land, to try and enlarge this location that was designated in these two location commissions in the late 19th and early 20th century. The argument being this is our land is a similar argument that was made in other parts of Leboa, particularly most famously known well because of the writings of Peter Delius in the case of the petty paramountcy, saying, why should I pay back? Why should I buy land that is mine in particular? And so these kind of much older debates are kind of bubbling up again in the 1980s as the political structure of Ga-Mphahlele is the one that is interfacing with the mining companies and trying to push back against who they are and what authority they have to sign off on various deals. So absolutely, in some of these questions of kind of ethnicity, who is in, who is out, and who is part of the tribal authority, resonating quite closely, and particularly in this case. And I think it would be interesting to talk about, if there was more time, to talk about cases where, as I say, in many cases of Leboa, where communities did not buy land back and nonetheless were making claims when there was mining and other encroachments on the land, to say that this land is ours, even though we don't have a title deed to make it. There's a kind of a set of different political dynamics that are going on, but Ga-Mphahlele is quite interesting because they do have this leverage that they can use. And then, sorry, one last point that kind of speaks a little bit to Gabriel Hecht, or kind of some of the comments you're making about Hecht's work, is that actually a lot of the efforts to access minerals in Leboa in this time is efforts to try and map out and make a legal claim to the minerals without yet doing full mining. There's only one instance where a major mine gets set up, and that's in the early 90s in what is now Mokopane. And so a lot of the battles are about prospecting, which, as I say, it's less kind of interventionist than actually mining. And so the granular details of how many people are actually getting kicked off the land to access the mine, to facilitate mining, are for many people quite speculative. They're about like what's going to happen in the future. People understand that it's going to happen in the future, but it only really starts happening about 10 or 15 years later.
Thanks, Laura. Fascinating. Great stuff. Okay, we are already over time. Thank you so much again. I look forward to reading your stuff. And thank you, everybody, for participating, your questions. And we have our Wednesday seminars, the series. You will find the schedule on our department website. Everybody is welcome. Usually we have 1 to 2, but sometimes, there are, some of our speakers will be joining us from other places, other time zones. So we might change some of the time zones, but we'll let you know. Again, thanks, Laura. Thank you, everybody. See you later.
Thanks, everyone.